And also for organizing this incredible event. So let's start to pause for a second and think just for yourself at a moment that you experienced with nature. It could be a place, a landscape, but not just as a backdrop, a situation you were part of. Maybe you were with an animal. Maybe you were with someone else. Maybe you were doing something special, or maybe you were just there. And maybe it was a familiar place, or a place you've never been before. Maybe it happened a long time ago, or maybe it was just yesterday. And something that was happening between you and the living word. Do you have it? Well, these moments, they do not only belong to childhood. They can happen at any moment of life. And they shape how we relate to the living word. Some people will call them nature experiences. And this is what I study. Not because they are exceptional, but because they are ordinary. And in these ordinary moments, much more is happening than we usually notice. To make sense of these relationships with the living word in a broader perspective, the biologist Edward Wilson proposed the concept of biofilia. Bio means life, and philia refers to love as attachment, affinity, concern. Biophilia, it describes the idea that humans may have developed over the course of evolution an orientation towards life and living processes. In this perspective, paying attention to the living word was part of how human societies adapted to their environments. This concept later became influential because it helped make sense of phenomena that were already being observed. For example, that contact with nature can support attention, well-being, or health. This is why biophilia has been taken up in fields such as urban planning or health. But biophilia also carries a stronger assumption that this orientation towards life could naturally support the protection of the living word. And, well, this is where attention appears. Despite this interest in nature and living beings, we are facing a global paradox. On the one hand, human societies are transforming landscape on a scale we have never seen before. Biodiversity is declining rapidly. Ecosystems are under pressure, driven by human activities. At the same time, our societies are undergoing profound transformations. Urbanizations, new ways of working, of moving, digital technologies, changing lifestyles that are reshaping how, where, and how often we encounter nature. And these dynamics, they're not separate. They are deeply connected. Our modes of development affect the health of ecosystems, and the state of ecosystems, in turn, they affect human health. And so, in this concept, the concept of biophilia, it raises important questions. So if humans are inclined to feel interest or attraction or affinity towards life, then why does this not lead more clearly to collective and lasting protection for biodiversity? And so, what this concept of biophilia can actually help us do today? What does biophilia allow us to understand from our relationships with nature in the 21st century? And where are its limits when it comes in supporting sustainable ways of caring for nature? Biophilia, it tells us that interest in life exists, but it does not tell us how this interest is lived, organized, or translated into action. And for that, we need to look at everyday life, at ordinary relationships with nature. And these relationships, they can take many forms. Through animals we lived with, pets that are loved, cared for, through gardens, cultivated spaces, through leisure, outdoor activities, walking, spending time in valued landscapes, through food and agriculture, what we eat, how food is produced, and how landscape and ecosystems are shaped to feed us. And through urban environments, green spaces, trees, and the everyday presence of non-human life in very dense cities. So these experiences are diverse, and they are deeply meaningful. They support quality of life in many, many ways. They often bring benefits for well-being and mental, physical, and social health, as well as pleasure, attention, learning, a sense of connection. So, in that sense, they're not opposed to biodiversity, but they're also ambivalent. The same practices that create attachment, they can also put pressures on ecosystems. Seeking green and pleasant environments can improve quality of life, while also contributing to habitat loss and landscape fragmentation. Gardening, leisure, tourism, food production, it can support living systems or degrade them, depending on how they are organized. And this imbalance, it's not marginal. It reflects the transformation of contemporary societies, such as urbanization, changes in rural worlds, food systems, and dominant economic models. So what this produces, it's not one relationship with nature, it's many partial, situated ones, fragmented across space, practices, and moments of life. And this fragmentation is a key. Each relationship with nature makes sense of its own, but together they do not always come as a coherent whole. And biodiversity, it cannot be protected through isolated experiences because it is systemic. And yet, it depends on collective choices, shared priorities, and social frameworks. Besides biodiversity loss, it's not only an ecological issue, it also transforms the conditions under which relationships with the living world can exist, as ecosystems are losing diversity and living environments become more homogeneous. The diversity of encounters, experiences, and learnings that people can have with the living world is reduced. It does not mean that people stop caring about nature, but it means that everyday relationships with nature tend to concentrate on what is familiar, accessible, and somehow manageable. And over time, the range of possible relationship narrows. And in that sense, biodiversity loss, it does not only affect ecosystems, it reshapes the social experience of the living world. So, to explain why interest in nature doesn't automatically lead into collective action for biodiversity, a common explanation is to say, well, people, they don't care enough. But this explanation misses something essential. What we observe, it's not a lack of concern, but the way relationships with nature are built in everyday life. People do care about nature, but they do so while navigating many other dimensions at the same time. And their relationship with the living world are rarely driven by a single value or intention. They are shaped by multiple concerns at once, social norm, economic constraints, and so on. As a result, relationships with nature, they are shaped through social, structured representation, compromises, routines. And in that sense, biophilia, it should not be understood as something that is automatic or universal. It depends strongly on the context people live in, their social condition, their experiences since childhood, and the cultural representation they inherit. In other words, loving nature is neither obvious, it's not given, and it's not guaranteed. It is something that is built. And that is why interest in nature on its own, it does not automatically become collective action. Not because it is weak, but because it is entangled in many aspects of everyday life. And this situation, there are not simple contradictions to be solved. There are tensions we need to work through. Because this is complexity, this is what it is made of. But this is not necessarily a weakness, it can also be an opportunity. And these relations, to nature, they matter to people precisely because they are connected to things that count in their lives. Health, well-being, social ties, learning, sense of belonging. And through these situated experiences, people encounter again and again the interdependence of their lives with other forms of life. Emotions plays a role here as one of the several forces that guide attention, values, and priorities alongside emotions that are bodily experiences, social interactions, knowledge, and so on. And this everyday relationship, they can support health, learning, and care. So, instead of asking why don't people care, a more useful question might be, how do we collectively support, connect, and give coherence to the many ways people already relate in nature, in everyday life? So where this works actually takes us. In school, for example, in concrete places where contacts with nature are reintroduced through everyday practices, being outside, observing, taking care, learning, living environments. It's not only about knowledge, these experiences shape attention, they normalize the presence of other forms of life. They make relationship with the living world part of what it means to grow up. In health and care settings, where contact with nature is increasingly mobilized to support well-being, mental health, and recovery, gardens, outdoor activities, access to green space, they do not replace medical care, but they open spaces to rethink what health means and how human health is linked to ecological conditions. They invite to a broader perspective, one that connects care for human with care for living environments. And in city, another example, through parks, urban biodiversities, and everyday planning decision. Cities, they're not places where nature survives. They are places where relationship with the living worlds are constantly negotiated. And today, many cities are considering nature-based solutions to respond to environmental and health challenges. But these actions also reveals inequalities in access to nature and exposure to environmental degradation. So these actions also make visible the tensions between comfort, accessibility, economic interests, and ecological limits. And this visibility, it matters because it turns abstract issues into debatable social and political questions. So what matters here, it's not multiplication or isolated project, but what are the conditions that will allow these experiences to exist and to connect with one another? And it requires collective framework to have time, to secure spaces for living environments, to allow attention to nature to be sustained and not just treated as secondary or an option. And this work is never done by people on their own. It also needs working together between institutions, authorities, educators, urban planners, economic actors, and citizens. And it also requires discussion, because no one relates to nature in the same way. Not everyone has the same priorities, the same constraints, or the same expectations. So supporting relationship with the living words means accepting disagreement. It means making tensions visible rather than hiding them, and learning to negotiate them collectively. So, going beyond biophilia, it does not mean abandoning the idea. It means taking it seriously, recognizing that the interest of nature in nature is real, that emotion matter, that ordinary experiences are powerful, but also acknowledging something essential, that none of this is automatic. Relations to the living world, they do not unfold on their own. They are constructed socially, culturally, politically. Oh, and so encourage them, it's necessary but not sufficient. Because loving nature on its own, it does not protect biodiversity. And caring on its own, it does not resolve tensions. So what makes the difference is how these relationships are supported, connected, and given direction to collective choices. These places we talked about are not ready-made solutions. They can reproduce inequalities. They can create new pressures. They can even fail. But they are places where societies learn, where priorities are being tested, where values are discussed, and tensions become visible. So places where there might be relationships with nature, they're not taken for granted. They are actively shaped. So supporting relationship with nature, it's not about returning to a past ideal, and it is not about finding the perfect model. It is about collectively inventing ways of living with nature under contemporary conditions. This is an ongoing process. And if we go back to the moment I asked you to think at the beginning, that moment with nature, it appears that it matters as an individual experience. And what matters just as much is what we choose to do with such moments, whether they remain isolated or whether they are recognized, shared, and allowed to contribute to a common way of paying attention, of caring, and of deciding how we live with nature. So beyond biophilia, the future lies in how we turn everyday relationships with nature into a shared responsibility. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.